Hello, Lars. So you're here under multiple hats. Could you take me through them all? Because I know you're one of the British Council climate change champions, but you're also here with the Canadian Youth Delegation and with the Tides Canadian Initiative.
Absolutely. I'll try to guide you through that maze. So I wear multiple hats in Canada as well. I'm here actually as a Canadian youth delegate. There's actually 28 of us here. I think we're the largest constituency within Youngo, so we're a Youngo society. That, however, is a project of the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition, which itself is a project of the Tides Canada Initiative Society, under whom officially we're accredited under. However, as well as that, I'm also an international climate champion with the British Council, which is an NGO under Britain and a bit of a non-governmental organisation there.
Okay, so what actually drives you then to do all this?
Well, what drives me is the fact that the world has all these desperate needs right now. It has so many issues that, if left unattended, I think we can all recognize, and I think this meeting kind of commemorates the concept that if they're left unattended, they certainly will fester and perhaps spiral into very kind of prolonged and exacerbating crises.
Do you think this type of meeting actually helps with tackling the problems?
I think this type of meeting shows the international commitment to tackle those sort of problems. I think that really what the world needs, certainly right now, are outcomes. And that's what all the societies, all the civil society certainly is striving for here, is an outcome which we actually feel is appropriate, which we actually feel we can agree with. At the same time, I wonder, and my worry is that the outcomes that we focus on aren't actually the most appropriate outcomes. The outcomes that we focus on may not actually be the ones that are the smartest bet in the long run.
Take me through the inappropriate and the appropriate ones then.
Absolutely. So what I feel truly, and many people I think do as well, is that the way we're focusing our practices, the way we're focusing particularly as well our money, in terms of sustainable development, doesn't actually have an eye towards the future as much as it should. I think what we really need is a much deeper grasp, much deeper understanding of human behavior. And from that behavior, we need to plan around how we encourage people towards sustainable behaviors, both in the developed and within the developing world. At the same time, we need to focus on not just how things are and how we want to change the present, but really in envisioning the future that we want to see, which is incredibly important in the battle towards sustainability. So we need to understand how people live right now, but also how they're going to live in the future, which to me truly means cities as well.
Are we talking about some mass public therapy then?
No, not necessarily. I think what we need to focus on more is understanding that behaviorally, it's so often that we take something of the path of least resistance. It's something that's very common to a lot of humanity, that coming up against struggles that are too hard, sacrifices that are too great, we will take a lesser path, even if there's environmental destruction involved. So we need to help design the sort of institutions and structures which encourage positive, sustainable behavior before even unsustainable behaviors are adopted. I think there are great opportunities for that, particularly in the developing world, which I like to call something of a paradigm nudge, where we can actually just shift people to the behaviors prior to them actually kind of adopting unsustainable ones. I think there are great opportunities for people to leapfrog the sort of behaviors which right now have landed the developed world in recognizing its historical responsibility for climate change, which I firmly do agree we do have as a member of Canada and the developed world. But at the same time, that the opportunities exist to leapfrog those behaviors in other places as long as we design the institutions right and invest in them properly the first time.
What kind of solutions are you talking about, and what kind of institutions do you think will be able to manage the delivery of those solutions?
Well, take the example of infrastructure. Right now, if you look at the way we invest in sustainable development, we take fat cap projects. We take projects which we know will have large greenhouse gas reductions in the present, well, not really considering what the kind of future infrastructure that we'd like to see could be. Well, take the example of transit infrastructure in cities. The developing world has a massive number of cities. If you look at the subcontinent of India, it has thousands of cities of 100,000 or more. I come from Canada, and frankly, that's preposterous to us. Like, we don't have that many cities, and certainly not many of 100,000. Those cities are great opportunities to invest in the sort of transit infrastructure that could actually have positive economic benefits and actually deal with a lot of the standard of living problems that exist, while encouraging and removing the sort of positive incentives that currently exist for people to pursue, for example, automobiles. If a great transit system already existed in India or was invested in India right now, the sort of incentives towards unsustainable behavior, such as personal automobiles don't necessarily exist in the same way. That's the sort of leapfrog that I think we really should invest in. That's the sort of leapfrog that I think can guide the way to the future.
I get your rhetoric, yeah, but in terms of outcomes from Cancun right now, what would help you on the way to achieving that?
So things that I think could really help in the way to achieving that, or something of a refocus of the CDM project, for example, the CDM mechanism, in the sense that looking at clean development not just as a process which is simply about greenhouse gas emissions right now, but also tackling other things within the United Nations mandate, looking at some of ideas of the human looking at ideas of the Millennium Goals, looking at different issues of population, looking at issues of migration as well, and considering how we want to improve people's standard of living in these areas while also pursuing sustainability, tackling more than one goal at the same time. That's what I think is possible if we refocus our activities within such things as the Cancun climate negotiations, to actually focus on ideas of how do we not just develop right now and just change kind of industrial production, but also look at how people actually live, change the infrastructure around how people actually live so that they can live better.
Yes, but getting people to change the way that they live takes centuries.
See, that's the thing that I don't necessarily agree with. And that's the thing that I think a lot of studies in academia is really going into. If you look at the field of behavioral economics, if you look at the field of sociology, if you look at the field of urban planning, all of them are coming to the realization there's commonalities in human behavior that spread across culture and actually are so fundamental to us that they can be very, very quickly adopted. I'll take the example of power bills. What people have done recently is they've used people's natural competitive drive to reduce power consumption. They send people their bill, but within that bill, they say, this is your average, this is your energy consumption. Look at how much higher it is than the consumption of your neighbors. They don't actually say what those neighbors are, they say neighborhood average. That automatically has reduced people's energy consumption without any large infrastructure investment, without any massive change or massive financial output, simply by the redesign of something as simple as a bill. That's an understanding of human behavior that's on a nuanced level, but can accomplish great things.
Are there any particular ideas that you have for changing human behavior?
The thing is, I think structural change is incredibly important, and one of the things that I think is really important is people understanding and not holding their governments accountable to their actions, but actually feeling that their governments have the transparency to really feel that the governments are doing the good work. I take the example of any large kind of tax expenditure and the concept that people don't really, because it can be so ethereal, because it can be so ununderstandable or vague, that people so often are aggressive to the idea of a tax increase because they can't actually tangibly feel or recognize the positive gains that they receive from it. But at the same time, if you were able to have that sort of communication, I think there's a revolution in communications technology that should come from government. I believe it's already happening, hopefully, that you can communicate the tangible positives that the government is delivering to you. And from that standpoint, people can be a lot more positive and accepting when these large kind of expenditures have to happen, when these large structural changes have to happen. I take the example of Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. Recently underwent an idea when it went through what's known as the Sustainable Cities Thinking Platform. The urban planning department has strived for the longest time to pursue what they call the greenest city in the world endeavor. They want to be the greenest city in the world by 2020. That's a huge, ambitious goal. But the thing is, they're also on track to that goal. However, they're starting to run out of ideas. They've hit all the easy things first. They know what works well, but they've hit it, they know what's cheapest. At the same time now, what they've done is they've created this social media platform in which everyone can submit ideas to create a more sustainable city. Moreover, though, everyone in the city got votes. Everyone in the city got votes to say, this is the ideas that we'd like to vote for. These ideas that we think are the absolute best. What that does is it creates a sort of transparency of government action when you can say, this is not only what we want, this is what we'd like. And things that already were happening, things that were already planned or had begun implemented, the plan department then was able to go back in and inform the public. They were then able, through this social media venue, to then say, oh, that's already planned, that's going to happen in 2015, or that's already begun. And at that point, when you see the government starting to spend money on such things as like an urban agricultural project, but it's an urban agricultural project that you voted for or you saw was really popular within this social media platform, or this platform, this like transparent democracy, that's something that you can attach to and you can actually see positive outcomes from. It's not just something that the vague government is doing, it's something that you are participatory in.
So when we look at behavioural change, then you want greater participation and greater accountability from government.
Yes.
In terms of the taxation issue, we just go back a little bit to
Sure.
taxation. What is it that you're arguing for on that? Apart from greater transparency, again.
What I would say is that certainly in terms of environmental activities,
Yeah.
I'm all for a carbon tax. I am all for a carbon tax. But moreover, what I'm for is a carbon tax which we can clearly see the benefit from. It shouldn't just be a carbon tax which just generally goes into public coffers. It should be a carbon tax which can very clearly be delineated towards like sustainability projects, can be clearly delineated towards renewable energies, can be clearly delineated towards renewable energy subsidies, efficiency subsidies, home retrofits. Ideas that it's a revenue neutral carbon tax. I think that's what government should strive for, and it's that sort of those sort of programs which I think can allow people to be a lot more welcoming of it, welcoming of these concepts which initially, I agree, they are very kind of aggressive towards, they're not willing to accept, but I think they'll be a lot more willing to accept when they have far more confidence that it's not just going to these big government expenditure, but directly to programs that they can see the outcomes of. Those are the sort of outcomes that I think can encourage acceptance, can encourage a change in that sort of behavior.
So what is it you think that the youth bring to the climate change negotiations?
I think we youth bring a lot of creativity. I think we bring often a new approach. At the same time, I think we bring a large moral mandate. I think that we recognize in this situation, and keep in mind it is Young and Future Generations Day, that we are one of the future generations. Last year at Copenhagen, one of the big campaigns was, how old will you be in 2050? That was to communicate the concept that not everyone here will be around in 2050, but the people who will, so often the youth, will have to deal with the outcomes of these negotiations, positive or negative. And that we recognize that as time goes on, as inaction prolongs, that our capacity to actually change, our capacity to actually achieve something of a reasonable, green, sustainable future that we can actually be happy with, diminishes, that window does close and closes far more rapidly as time goes on. There's a situation of diminishing returns here, and unfortunately those returns, the interest on them, is what we will inherit. The concept that we will inherit this planet is a very powerful moral mandate, and it's one where we can say, think of us, your children, or think of our children, think of your grandchildren, and from that perspective understand how important it is that you maintain the task.
It's kind of odd that the people that are going to be most influenced by climate change,
Yes.
the people that are going to be most impacted by climate change are the people with the least influence. Do you have a view on that?
Could you repeat the question, please?
The people who are going to be most impacted by climate change are the ones that have the least influence. Do you have a view on that?
I have a view that it's an absolute travesty. I think it absolutely
Do you think
is.
it's true?
I think it absolutely is true. I take the example even within the Youngo delegation, a delegation which strives for an absolute plurality similar to the United Nations in and of itself. But at the same time, we had, I believe, one African youth. From the entire continent of Africa, we had one African youth. Due to fundraising issues, due to the fact that within civil society there, it's so difficult to actually get grant funding for initiatives such as this. That's an absolute travesty. I also speak to the concept that within the United Nations itself, we have organizations such as IOSIS that have had to organize themselves because as individual delegations, they don't have the capacity to negotiate in the multilaterally of tracks that exist within the complexity of such a system. Whereas opposed to Canada, where I believe we brought something like 130 people within our party, which is more than the youth brought as well, that we have more than enough people to cover every single meeting. Simply that doesn't exist. That capacity does not exist in other organizations. So they've had to find some commonality to band together to create the sort of capacities that they otherwise would not have. That is underrepresentation. That's obvious underrepresentation of capacity and skills. And that it does lead to a bias and a weighting of the overall argumentation that happens within the negotiations themselves.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.